So section 5, occupation. What did Nazi rule mean for the different people of Europe? So just to start off, always interesting to see it from a British perspective. We have here just some examples of Nazi occupation of the Channel Islands, and the rather haunting photograph there of a British policeman and Lloyd's Bank with Nazi soldiers marching through the area. So Channel Islanders, 4,000 of them, a population of 66,000, were sentenced for breaking the law. 570 were imprisoned. But largely they refused to help to be part of Hitler's defensive Atlantic Wall, and so the Nazis had to bring in slave labour, which included 4 concentration camps built in Alderney for 16,000 prisoners, of which 700 died due to harsh treatment. Amongst the islanders themselves, some women had a relationship with the Nazis, others created underground newspapers or wrote anti-Nazi graffiti. So a range of different responses. Right, so what we're going to start off by looking is how, this is one of the key exam questions, is how the Nazis treated various different areas of the occupied Nazi empire that was created. And we start off in the east with Poland. So we need to bear in mind that Poland was very much seen as Germany's to take over, as part of the idea of Lebensraum, or living space. After the invasion in 1939, they wanted pretty much to destroy Poland, including its culture, its government, and to Germanize the country, to make it a part of Germany. By October 1939, so very early on, Poland had pretty much ceased to exist. It had been divided into 5 different regions, with the largest area in the middle known as the general government. So they wanted the general plan that were going to apply for the rest of Europe. They were tested in Poland. Polish or Slavic people, who were seen as Untermenschen, were removed as soon as possible and replaced with Germans. Hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens expelled, and they brought in 500,000 ethnic Germans to settle in their houses and in their land. So it was a wiping out of Poland. As part of this, the terror that followed under Gauleiter Hans Frank's German government area, schools and universities were closed. They arrested 30,000 intellectuals, political leaders, and tortured or murdered them. The Slavic Poles were seen as racially inferior, and it wasn't just the Jews. There was almost 2 million non-Jewish citizens were killed, and 1.5 million deported to Germany as forced labour. As the Jews had to wear the J or the Star of David later on, Poles had to wear a P on their arm. They were paid a lower wage, and sexual relations, just like the Jews, was banned. The Jews themselves were concentrated in ghettos, and 3 million of the 3.5 million Polish Jews were killed in death in concentration camps. The Polish did fight back. There was a delegatura, a secret state in Poland was established by the government, which had fled to London. And towards the end of the war, the famous Warsaw Uprising saw 2 straight months of rebelling against the Nazi rule. It was ultimately unsuccessful, and it led to the complete destruction of Warsaw. Patients were shot in hospitals, 200,000 people were killed. So the Nazis clearly got their revenge for that. Very, very different story in the West, in Netherlands. The Dutch government surrendered in May 1940, so not that much different to Poland. Again, they escaped in exile to Britain, as did the Dutch royal family. The Dutch also had a Gauleiter in charge, so Arthur Seyss Inquart. They did get rid of democracy, and the parliament was dissolved. However, and this is the big difference here, the Dutch were seen as sharing the same ethnic background as the Germans, so civil servants were allowed to continue, although it should be noted that around 1/3 of all Dutch mayors resigned. And the Dutch education system was left alone because they didn't want a backlash. So in this early period, although they got rid of democracy, they didn't want to rile the Dutch. They didn't want to create a rebellion. In the early stages, the Dutch showed compliance. So civil servants were asked to fill in an ancestry form because they wanted to get rid of Jewish elements, and nearly all of them did so. There was small amounts of resistance. The Prince Bernhard's birthday was celebrated, Carnations were worn in support of the Free Dutch, and in response there was a response which wasn't too great from the Germans. They removed royal portraits, they changed royal street names, but no one was actually punished. Now, the turning point happens in 1941, 1942, and so we get into February 1941, and for the first time we get Jews being rounded up. So 425 Jews are rounded up for deportation. Dutch communists called for a strike. 9 were killed, hundreds were arrested in protests, and from March that year we see the first death sentences against Dutch citizens, with 3 strikers and 15 members of the Dutch resistance being shot. This is the start of the resistance and the beginning of a different treatment of the Dutch. So by 1942, Dutch Jews already had to wear the Star of David, and then in 1943 we get intimidation increasing. This is largely because the Germans start deporting Jews to extermination camps in huge numbers. 76% of the total Jewish population in the Netherlands, 107,000 Jews were deported. Now, that was partly because of the compliance of the Dutch, or actually because the Dutch population was concentrated in a small urban area, and a large part, it was difficult to hide. And then the second stage, not only Jews, but 300,000 Dutch former soldiers were transported to work in Germany. We saw earlier how eventually up to a quarter of the workforce of Germany was made up of foreign workers. Strikes in protest of this led to 95 being killed and 400 wounded. Then we've got 18 to 35-year-old men having to report for forced labour. Only 54,000 of those did so. 170,000 should have done so. Only 54,000 did so immediately. But by 1944, all men aged 16 to 60 had to do so, with around 500,000 being forced to comply with this, which is around a third of all eligible men. At this time, Dutch resistance clearly develops. 300,000 are going into hiding by 1944. We get illegal pamphlets, we got armed attacks on registry offices for ration coupons and blank identity cards so they can carry on living their lives. 20,000 resistant workers were arrested, most of which are sent to Dutch camps, and we have 2,000 Dutch resistance fighters were executed. Late in 1944, as the Allies start moving across Europe and trying to free up Germany, we got rail workers going into hiding to stop the transport system. There's a severe lack of coal and food, with severe food shortages, and 20,000 Dutch actually die of starvation. Netherlands was liberated by Canadian soldiers in May 1945. And you've got there on the top right the diary of Anne Frank, a German who had fled to the Netherlands and was of course discovered by the Nazis. Now it brings us to the Holocaust. During the Holocaust, it's estimated around 11 million individuals were murdered, of which 6 million were Jewish, but there were also Slavs, Gypsies, communists, homosexuals, and various others. 1939, there had been 9.5 million Jews in Europe, mostly in the East, and in keeping with Nazi philosophy, in keeping with Hitler's philosophy, as seen in Mein Kampf, they decided that this needed a solution. Now, the question you may receive here is, how far was this a planned action? To begin with, the model that they came up with, the first solution was to persecute, yes, but also to allow immigration, and this is known as the Vienna model. So in Austria, the first policy was to force Jews to leave the country, to get them out of there. And after the Nazi invasion, Jews were beaten, they were humiliated, they were looted, they took their property off them. But many were considered and promoted to emigrate through the Central Office of Jewish Immigration. And 110,000 of a total of 167,000 Jews in Vienna, and of a total of almost 200,000 Jews in Austria, emigrated in 2 years. This was known as the Vienna model and was to be repeated in Czechoslovakia the next year. So in this very first early stage, yes, there's persecutions, yes, they steal their money, but actually the focus is on deportation, forced immigration. Now, one of the issues with this is Poland, really, because there's such a high population of Jews in Poland. They realised that an immigration plan wouldn't work in a country with 3.5 million Jews. So They move all the Jews to a reservation area, and although they considered sending the Jews, deporting the Jews to the Soviet Union or Madagascar, they didn't yet control such an area, so instead they concentrated the Jews into ghettos until this would be possible. So that plan was still something that was being considered. There was a huge ghetto in Warsaw, 3-meter high walls, barbed wire, almost 500,000 Jewish inhabitants, which is 1/3 of the city's population, in just 2.4% of the land. On average, 15 people shared a small apartment. Disease and death was common. Not surprisingly, outbreaks of disease such as typhus in autumn 1941, and 140,000 people die in the ghetto in horrific conditions. Phase 3, the third solution, is murder. And not the murder by the death camps yet, but by these groups known as Einsatzgruppen, and these task forces, because there are 4 task forces, A, B, C, and D, but up to 1,000 men in each. And the sad story of taking the Jews to secluded wooded areas, forcing them to strip, dig their own graves, and then shot. And of the areas where they operated, around 1 million Jews, 90% of the total in these areas, were murdered in the autumn and winter of 1941 to 42. So a more sinister step has now taken place with the dealing of the Jewish problem, as it was called. They realised that actually this process was inhumane, as they would call it, not for the Jews but for the executors. So they started trialing different methods in the Chelmno camp. They trialed the murder of Jews through exhaust fumes in camps, with the hope that this would have a less psychological impact on the SS killers. There wasn't a location found for the Jewish reservation, so this provided a solution. So from autumn 1941, Operation Reinhard saw the deliberate execution of Jews in the general government area of Poland, and they set up extermination camps, deliberate extermination camps in Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, murdering Jews in these newly constructed gas chambers away from the large towns, and with in each of them only 20 to 35 officers, deliberately to try to maintain the secrecy. You can see those camps on the right hand side in the east part of that image on the bottom right there. So they would be herded onto these trains like cattle, often using cattle trains in fact. They'd be sent to a shower block, and they would be gassed, and then Jewish slave labourers would be forced to bury or burn the bodies. The Jews themselves have been told they're being resettled, but the rumours soon spread about it. At Sobibor, in 1944, the Jews did fight back, and 11 SS guards were killed, with 300 Jews escaping, but these were sadly isolated examples of resistance and couldn't change with the fact that by 1945, 1.7 million Polish Jews had been murdered in these death camps. Now, this had been trialled, and as far as the Nazis were concerned, had been successful. So in January 1942, the Wannsee Conference, this was where, although very little was written down that was clear on this, they decided to lay out the plans under Heydrich of the gassing of Jewish people. It included really precise numbers of Jews in each country, in each area, and even included plans for British Jews. Adolf Eichmann, a senior SS officer, was put in charge of this. And this was known as the final solution to the Jewish question. The most famous, arguably, of all the Jewish extermination camps was at Auschwitz, which now became a death factory. It was originally a labour camp. Experiments using Zyklon B began in 1941, September 1941, and it was so successful that actually it was overrun with prisons. So a second site, Auschwitz II Birkenau, was created with 4 gas chambers and a crematoria. 75% of those arriving were immediately gassed. Some were sent to work, those deemed fit enough to work in the associated factories as slaves. And they even included Sonderkommando, special unit groups of Jews whose job it was to get the bodies to be burned. They're very proud of their efficiency in this killing, in this slaughter, in this murder, with 12,000 Jews murdered per day. An estimated 1.1 million being murdered at Auschwitz, which is equivalent to around 1/6 of all Holocaust victims. With the Russians approaching and Germany looking to lose the war, Himmler ordered the gas chamber destroyed, and they didn't want to just leave the Jews, so 58,000 were put on a death march towards Germany, long distances, thousands dying on the way. But 20,000 of those were actually liberated at Bergen-Belsen in Netherlands by the British in April 1945. How did different people react to this? Well, if we look at one example in France, so we have in the north we get the occupied zone, and the south we get the free zone, the Vichy France led by Pétain. Occupation in the north, there was anger because of the swastikas and because the Germans plundered food. There was strict censorship. French had to be in their houses by a certain time. French workers were taken to work in Germany, as we've mentioned before. Many refused to leave. After 1942, over 70,000 French Jews were deported to death camps, sadly, with many French being part of the Vichy government, taking part in the administration of this. People did take part in minor acts of resistance, listen to the BBC, helping them resistance. Those who actively resisted the Nazis built an execution chamber in Paris. They were making it clear that they weren't to be messed with. We've got two examples here of responses to German occupation. So André Chocmé is a pastor in southeast France. They'd done small acts of resistance, so they refused to read an oath to Pétain, the French leader who was in charge of Vichy France, the collaborative French. He was active in trying to liberate Jewish, mostly children, hiding them in homes and hostels, finding them identification cards, helping them to flee to Switzerland or hiding them in the mountains whenever they heard that the Vichy police or the Germans were checking on what was going on. In February 1943, Chocmé was arrested, released on a lack of evidence. By 1944, Chocmé and other villagers saved around 5,000 Jews. So an active resistance there in the southeast. By way of contrast, Coco Chanel, the famous fashion designer and perfume maker, stayed in Paris when the Nazis arrived, began a romance with von Dinklage, a German military officer, and even used her position to unsuccessfully try to remove Jewish directors of a perfume company using new anti-Semitic legislation, anti-Jewish laws. It's been claimed by the historian Hal Vaughan that actually she was potentially a German spy and had used her close friendship with Winston Churchill to try to negotiate a peace, and that maybe she was active during the war years, but the Allies covered it up because of her friendship with Churchill. So a very contrasting example there, and it's up to individuals to decide how far someone like that is guilty, or is it just an example of someone making their way and surviving in this world, or is it treason? Effectively, how do you see that? So a few examples of how the Nazis were greeted in different areas. In Denmark, they were given favourable trade relations, so the government could later, by bargaining, reject legislation against Danish Jews. In France, we get guerrilla warfare, we get underground newspapers. They deliberately helped to push the Allies, help the Allies to push the Nazis out of France. In Monaco, a very interesting one, they turned over foreign refugees but protected their own Jews. In Croatia, we get extreme political party, the Ustasa, making concentration camps and killing 25,000 Jews. Similar story in Latvia, again in the east, with the Latvian Auxiliary Security Police. They used volunteers to kill communists, and 26,000 Jews, half the total population of Jews in that country. Resistance in Poland, then you may know the film Defiance, which tells the story of the Bielski partisans. Four brothers escaping the Jewish ghetto in Poland, living in the forest, over 1,200 living there, surviving for 2 years, numerous attempts at sabotage against Nazi rulers. And it's also worth mentioning that there were significant numbers of Poles who rescued, fed, hid, up to almost 500,000 Jews with help from the Polish underground state. Contrasting story in Greece, where 3 prime ministers, under the influence of the Nazis, passed legislation including the formation of the 22,000 strong security battalion, who actively sought out and persecuted Greek communists there.